Good evening and welcome to The Journey Home. I'm Marcus Grodi, your host for this program. As I've said many times, and just in case you're a new viewer on this program, I have this great privilege every week from EWTN to hear the stories with you of men and women who, for their love for truth and their desire to get closer to God through our Lord Jesus Christ, discover, often to their a great surprise, the beauty of the church established by our Lord. And often that has great upheaval in their lives, but also accompanied with the great joy. So every week I have this privilege of bringing into your homes these men and women, and sometimes EWTN gives me particularly great privileges. And tonight is one of those. We have as our guest tonight what would be considered a classic Catholic convert, a prolific writer of the 19th century. Our guest tonight is Orestes Brownson, who lived in America between 1803 and 1876. And as I said, he's a classic Catholic convert and author. And what great privilege it is to meet you, having read many of your books. What a great privilege.
Thank you, Marcus.
Orestes.
It's great to be here.
Have you joined us on this program?
Yes, indeed.
Something I had never expected to happen. My guess is it wasn't something you ever expected to happen either.
Well, but I'm open to so many possibilities, and here we are.
Well, that statement that you're open to so many possibilities in many ways is a kind of a summary of your life, wouldn't you say, looking back?
Indeed. In fact, I would say that the story of my journey into the Catholic Church is a story of following many different paths, but following them with consistency and with loyalty to the truth, and eventually seeking and finding, as our Lord promised us. He who seeks will find, and if you knock, it will be answered. All my life, I was seeking and I was loyal to the path that eventually brought me to the fullness of the truth.
I'm guessing, given where you were born and where you're brought up, which I'd like you to share with the audience, that the spark for the Catholic Church wasn't there in the beginning at all.
You could say that. In fact, that's an understatement. It was a very anti-Catholic atmosphere. I was born in 1803 in Vermont, but before I tell you a bit about my early life, Marcus, since you're a reader, you will probably know the answer to this quiz, but I'm going to say some things that describe a certain group of people in a certain decade or series of decades in American history, and you tell me what era I'm describing. The advocation of free love, the advocation of the complete reform of the institution of marriage, the idea that it takes a village to raise a child, so much so that a child should be forcibly removed from the family, sent to compulsory state education, schools that would shape and mold human nature so as to fit a socialist or communist utopian ideal. What am I talking about?
Yeah, well, you're given the beautiful gift of hindsight now, looking back on your own life, but our viewers would say, well, that certainly sounds like the age in which we now live.
Indeed. Well, I'm talking about the 1820s, the 1830s, and the 1840s. Things were very similar then as they are now, with one big exception, and that is we were a younger nation. It was more rural. More people lived on farms, although there was an industrialization going on. And there was an anti-Catholic sentiment in the air, but also there was a Protestant atmosphere that everyone breathed regardless of whatever denomination they happened to be in.
And I don't want to interrupt your thought, Orestes, but something important to what we're going to talk about later, just to make sure our audience understands that, is the time you're talking about. This idea of industrialization and its effects on our lives was really on the increase. But many of the things that we now in the 21st century take for granted, you never ever experienced, though you were warning people in your writings about the influence of what this industrialization was going to do to our lives. You were warning that 180 years ago.
I was, and I think we were seeing the beginnings of the problems you're having in the modern era. I believe what you now call the dictatorship of relativism was actually well advanced, even in the 1830s and the 1840s. But I'll get to that.
Yep.
We'll begin with my early years. I was born September 16th, 1803 in Vermont. My father died soon after my birth, and my mother, realizing she could not raise me, gave me up to an elderly couple who lived in an even more remote and rural location in Vermont. I was raised without any contact with other children. I was not formally educated. I was taught to read, and I read on my own. I was particularly fond of the scriptures and memorized large passages of them. And I had, even in my youth, a great interest in religious questions and in questions of the faith. I would say even in my young days as a child, I would pray, although I didn't consider it prayer then, and perhaps it wasn't. I would have conversations with Jesus, with Mary, and with the Archangel Gabriel. I never felt myself alone, even when I was most alone. And I was so interested in matters of religion. And as you say, I lived in a different era. We had no internet, no electricity, no television. At the age of 9...
Even a published book was a treasure.
Indeed. Yeah. Well, a published book was very much a treasure. At the age of 9, it was announced that the local militia would be on display and on parade in the community near us. You can imagine what this would mean when there's no other form of entertainment. At the age of 9, I went to town to see the parade and the militia, but I spent all of my time distracted by and fascinated with a conversation on the street corner between two adults who were discussing questions of theology, specifically faith versus works. And as a 9-year-old, I entered into the conversation with them. So at an early age, I was very interested in these subjects.
Was it a home discussion at all?
Well, not really. The couple who raised me were older. They were very virtuous, but not particularly devout. We were members of the Christian Connection, which was one of the numerous sects that grew up in our day. They eventually merged with the Congregationalists. But I can tell you a story about that. They catechized me at our meetings, the Christian Connection, but I recognized right away that they didn't exactly believe what they were saying. At least it didn't seem that they did. And really, they didn't mention baptism, they didn't mention the church, but they kept saying that I had to be born again, although I never really got the sense of what that meant, and I don't think they really did themselves. Now, we had a neighbor down the hill, an older woman, who knew how precocious I was in questions of the faith. And so when I was 12 years old, and I've remembered this ever since, she said to me, "You know the founder of the Christian Connection, don't you?" I said, "Well, of course, he comes to the meetings. He founded the church and he's there." She said, "I knew John Wesley. I knew Whitefield, the founders of the Methodist Church." She said, "These are new lights. You have to seek the church that has subsisted through the ages,
Wow.
that was founded by Jesus Christ." Now, I didn't quite know what that meant or where that would lead me, but I never forgot that. At the age of 14, I left home to make my way in the world, and that might shock some of your viewers and listeners. But the fact is, even though we were more advanced in the sense that we would become adults earlier, we still had what many of your teenagers or adolescents, as you call them, experience. I did in particular. I had a great sense of doubt and despair, because by then I had read enough and I had thought enough that, to me, the world was a stream flowing out of darkness into darkness. Heaven was depeopled, the earth was a barren wasteland and a desert. And yet, as a young man, 14, 15, 16, I had a great desire to believe, but I had nothing to believe in. And I didn't feel as if there really was anything objective to believe in. And yet in my heart, there was this great longing for sympathy, and yet nothing that answered me sympathetically. I couldn't understand why I could not shift and mold my heart and my mind to simply accept this and to come to terms with a world that for me was a sham and a fraud, which is all I saw around me. By the time I was 19, I was in such a panic and in such despair that I entered the first church that I came to that was having a meeting almost at random. It was a Presbyterian church in a small town where I was living at the time. Now, the Presbyterians in my day, this must have been 1822, the Presbyterians in those days were a bit more strict than I believe they are in your day. They were very true to their Calvinist roots, and they were very true to their Puritan environment. I entered the Presbyterian church, and I told them that I wanted to become a member. I knew that I had to sacrifice my reason and follow faith alone, and I did. But I also knew right away that I had made a mistake. Marcus, their meetings were characterized by a singular sense of uncharity, bigotry, an apparent zeal for the glory of God, and a keen regard for the interests of this world. If you were a Presbyterian, you could advance socially and in your business through your contacts with the other Presbyterians. Indeed, we were only supposed to have concourse with Presbyterians. Other members of our church, we were to shun all the other Protestants around us. Beyond that, I realized that it would take me many years to elongate my visage enough to frown as seriously as they were in order to appear to fit in. Now, I recognize this probably does not apply to the Presbyterians of your day, but in my day it did. In addition, we were supposed to constantly spy upon one another. Every one of us was in great fear that we would be reported to the elders for being the least bit unchristian, or to be at least perceived to be the least bit non-pious. And so we were all in great fear that we were being spied upon at all times, with one consolation, which was we were at least allowed to spy upon one another. I was in fear that if I spoke in a natural tone of voice, if I exhibited one spontaneous emotion, or if I should crack a smile, that I would be reported as a heretic and denounced by the elders of my church. Eventually, I realized I had made a mistake, not so much because of the general character or tone of the meetings. I recognized philosophically and intellectually what the mistake was. If, as Calvin teaches, or at least implies, that we have no free will and ultimately no real reason that we can exercise, then the error of Calvinism is building a theology upon a revelation that is made to an unreasonable creature. Consequently, there is no authority in the Presbyterian Church. I had desperately in my soul sought for a religious authority external to myself and found none. I had lost my reason, and I had found no authority, and no authority to confirm my faith. So I did what I thought was the only thing I could do to be true to myself and to my beliefs, and that was to leave the Presbyterian Church.
Let's pause there just for those that might be just turning in. I'm presently interviewing Orestes Brownson, who lived from 1803 to 1876, classic Catholic convert and author. Did those Presbyterians essentially then come up with their own image of God, in other words, based on this understanding of what Calvin was trying to get at? In the process, they end up with coming a God that's completely different than even the God that Calvin intended?
Yes, I think so. And I think one of the things that I did from that point on in my life was react against that.
Yeah.
Was react against a God who was perceived to be simply judgmental and in fact almost vindictive and in a sense arbitrary in the graces or the punishments that he bestowed upon humanity. Reacting against that, I decided, well, I sacrificed reason for the sake of faith. I'm going to now sacrifice my faith and follow my reason, even if it leads me to a natural religion. And I want to point out now, Marcus, that this was a fundamental characteristic of American society in my day. There was a split. The split for the Protestants, and we were a Protestant culture, was between nature and grace. The Protestants never really understood grace as being infused in our human nature, as becoming habitual, and as actually creating any sort of change within our natures. At best, grace was a sort of token that God would give us, which we could then use in a sort of sense to trade back. Also, the supernatural and the natural were split. Church and state was split. And I found people's profession of faith and people's practice was split. My entire life from that point on was to try to find a way of unifying this bifurcation in American society and in questions of faith and reason.
You seem like, as a young man, if I'm going to believe this, then it's going to make a difference in all of my life. That seemed to be the part of your personality that so shaped you, really your whole life. If this is true, then it's got to shape all that I am.
And even though I think there's always a great deal of hypocrisy in human nature, I think Americans in particular are given over to a kind of basic honesty. If I'm going to do this, I'm going to do it right, and I'm going to be true to myself and true to following the lights as best I can that God has given me. That is indeed what I intended to do. So upon leaving the Presbyterian Church, I really went, in a sense, to the other extreme. I became a Universalist. Universalists, of course, teach universal salvation, that no one is condemned, that we all get to heaven. That was really, in a sense, the answer to the Presbyterian Calvinistic insistence upon a judgmental and a vindictive God. For Universalists, God could not be that by human reason alone, we saw punishment as existing for the sake of reform. When we whip our children, we whip the bad out of them and the good into them. The only reason we punish people now is in order to improve them. Well, if that's the case, then if you follow that reasonable argument, hell makes no sense. How could there be eternal suffering and eternal punishment with no chance of reform? Therefore, we taught and we believed universal salvation. I did not completely understand the Universalist doctrines and the Universalist teachers and ministers and writers, but that didn't stop them or stop me. They made me, and I became a Universalist minister. So I was, in a sense, the blind leading the blind, preaching, writing, and teaching as a Universalist. But what I found, and what began to unsettle me, was I was as true to that as I was to Presbyterianism. I followed the logical progression, and that is, if you're only taking your reason, what do you do with the Bible? What happens to Holy Scripture? I recognized even then that the only reason to accept the Bible as an infallible authority on anything was because the Catholic Church had compiled it and had proclaimed it, according to the Church, through the authority of the Holy Spirit as being inerrant. Well, we all Protestants have this in common. We reject the infallible authority of the Catholic Church. With all of the variations in our doctrines and teachings, that much we have in common. In rejecting that, what do you do with Holy Scripture? Particularly when Jesus is quite clear about the question of eternal punishment. Eternal punishment cannot be denied from what Jesus says in the Gospels. I knew then that to be true to following reason, the Bible had to become one of a series of books, but really worse than that. The Bible was leading men astray, leading them from this natural evolution of seeing God as a loving and forgiving and accepting God and seeing him the way the Calvinists had. The Bible was, in fact, from my mind, doing damage. And I suspected that the other Universalists felt the same, and we were marching under the banner of the Christian church or Christianity without really believing. We were promoting a kind of new religion under a Christian banner, otherwise people would have been too shocked. I suspected that of my fellow Universalists, but I think I did them a disservice. Most people don't follow their presumptions to their logical conclusions as I attempted to do. So, at any rate, by the end of my Universalist adventure, I found that I was totally without faith.
What would be your age about that time? Where were you at that time?
At that time, I was still a young man.
Okay.
We're talking about maybe the 1830s.
Okay, you're in
So
your-
I'm in my 20s or 30s.
Okay.
I have come to a point in my life where I feel that I am teaching as a minister and preaching something that I do not believe in my heart or in my soul. My last 2 years as a Universalist minister were the most anti-Christian of my life, and I was struggling then with a greater sense of despair and guilt than I ever experienced before or since. I finally came out and began publishing and writing as a frank unbeliever, not a disbeliever. I never asserted that God did not exist, but I said at the very least, we cannot through our reason say that he exists. This shocked people, this offended people, not, Marcus, because I admitted an infidelity. Actually, yes, because I admitted it. Not because I had it, but because I said it. I think many people in my society in those days had a basic infidelity that they carried around with them and a basic sense of doubt. But to say such a thing openly was considered bad form.
Now, that was the first and last time you ever shocked anybody in your life, right?
No. It was one of many times that I shocked people.
But I think that was part of your convictions to carry it out and to express it.
Yes, Marcus, even at the risk of putting my own livelihood in jeopardy. I had children, I was married, I made my living as an author and a publisher. And over the many changes in my life, even though I was trying to be consistently true to my beliefs and to what I was following, the general public would be shocked and appalled at me. Subscriptions would be canceled. I would lose positions. People would stop publishing my writings. So at great risk to myself, I in fact shocked and offended people over the course of my publishing and writing career.
So there you are as a young man, have backed yourself into an unbelieving corner and published it.
Yes.
So what happened next? I mean, how did you get out of that hole?
I didn't lose my compulsion to do good. I still loved my neighbor, even though I wasn't quite sure who God was and whether or not I could love God. I knew that although there could not be a heaven hereafter, or at least that was in doubt, I could at least give myself to building and forming a heaven on this earth. And I will say this much about doing so as a frank unbeliever. I think for a nation of hypocrites, there is no chance for conversion. For a nation of unbelievers, there is. And so I then proceeded as a world reformer. I aligned myself with some of the transcendentalists, but in particular what I saw was the need to make life on this earth more palatable, to ameliorate the suffering of my fellow man. Now, without a Christian foundation and without a supernatural authority, what we had in those days is, I think, what you have now. I associated myself with some of the socialists, some of the early socialists, indeed, in particular, with a woman named Fanny Wright. Many people don't know who Fanny is anymore. Many of your so-called feminists know about her, and they think of her as an early hero. Fanny did some harm to the morals and to the beliefs of this country, but she did so with the best intentions. She came over from England, and the first thing that offended her was Negro slavery in the South. She started a community in Tennessee where she brought slaves and gave them their freedom with the hope that it would be a utopian environment. We were doing that all over in those days. Utopian communities were springing up in New York, in New England, in the West, in the South. This community that Fanny established soon degenerated and could not continue. That was pretty much the story for all of these utopian communities. And Fanny saw at the time that the problem was not so much slavery in the South for the black man. The problem was slavery in the North for the white man. A tree of evil had grown up in this country with two great branches, slavery in the South and slavery in the North. In the North, it took the form of wage slavery. The slave owners in the South were obligated, because of the culture and tradition, of caring for their slaves almost as members of their family. They could, admittedly, sometimes whip them, and perhaps some slave owners would be too harsh. But in the North, if you were an employer, if you owned a factory, and you had industrial workers at your whim, they were not part of your family. You were under no obligation to make sure that they were kept secure or well-fed. In fact, because of the very nature of our economic system, which was based upon selfishness and competition, it was to your advantage to make sure that your workers were on the brink of starvation and always very much in need of you and what you doled out to them. And so we had an entire mass of people who had become dispossessed, who had a few generations earlier owned and worked on their own farms. But now I saw labor and capital split in the same way that there were these other splits in our society, philosophically and religiously. We had quite pragmatically the split between labor and capital. My idea was to address that split and to try to get workers once again in control of their own capital so that they could reap the rewards of their own labors and not have all of their fruits go to their de facto slave owners.
You know, for our contemporary audience that's listening to you now, again, we live in a time when much of the stuff you never experienced at all in your life, we take for granted. At the time you're talking, the cusp of when your history you're talking, people were still heating their homes with kerosene or with whale oil. The whole oil industry had not taken off. Railroads had not taken off. Steel had not taken off. And you were seeing at that time the growing of these industries, which was in fact dependent upon these wage slaves, because the men that were promoting steel and oil and the railroads were justifying this is for the good of the nation. In the process, the thousands of men in the pits were worse than Southern slaves.
It was not for the good of the nation. It was for the good of the small group of moneyed individuals who controlled the policy of our nation and who even controlled our elections. That was my main idea, was to try to reform that. Fanny went a little further. She was a little more radical in that she saw the need to reform society from the ground up. I mentioned earlier free love and the, in a sense, the abolition of marriage. Fanny was promoting that. She was an early advocate of birth control. She felt that marriage was a burden that people could not endure. And although that's shocking, and although even many of your viewers and listeners now realize that that's created quite a few problems in your modern world, you must recognize that that is the necessary outgrowth, really, of Calvinism. If we do not have free will, and if grace does not operate as an infused habit in us, then marriage cannot be a sacrament. And if marriage is not a sacrament that conveys a supernatural aid, then in fact, as anyone who's married can tell you, it is naturally speaking impossible to enter into a covenantal relationship with another person that will last your entire life and that will be based on mutual sacrifice. As human beings, we simply can't do that. In addition, in our day, this was the Romantic era in literature. All of the Romantic poets and novelists were saying, love is a sentiment. We are at the mercy of love. Love is fatal. We can do nothing but obey our sentiment. And if that's the case, well, if you're no longer in love with your wife, you have in fact an obligation to leave her and to find another woman that will fulfill this sentiment that you must follow, for your free will is not a question of love.
Why don't we pause at that, but we'll leave our audience with that thought to meditate on during our break. As I mentioned earlier today, I'm interviewing Orestes Brownson, who lived between 1803 and 1876, a classic Catholic convert and author, and we'll be back with him in just a moment. Welcome back to The Journey Home. I'm your host, Marcus Grodi, and today I'm interviewing Orestes Brownson, classic Catholic convert and author who lived in the 19th century between 1803 and 1876. Orestes, I've interrupted you in the midst of your journey, and you've left us with this description of this woman who had not only great influence in her own day, but has to this day lingering influences on the feminist movement and the culture and our understanding of marriage and family.
In fact, I wrote something about Fanny Wright, the woman we're talking about. I would like to just read the few sentences I wrote about her. She followed out with logical consistency the principle of private judgment in faith and morals, and none who recognize that principle and deny all infallible teaching have any right to reproach her. She did great harm, and the morals of the American people feel even today the injury she did to them, but she acted according to her lights and was at least no hypocrite. Many who condemn her have been and are greater sinners than she. Private judgment is all we as Protestants had from the Reformation on. Without an infallible external authority, we have to fall back on private judgment. All Fanny Wright did was apply the principle of private judgment in faith and morals to the problems of her day, which included marriage and included economics and included slavery and so forth. So although she was considered radical, and although she is very much in line with your radical reformers of today, nevertheless, she was consistent to the Protestant principle of private judgment. Now, one of the things Fanny did was align herself with New Harmony, Indiana, which was another utopian community that she and Robert Owen, a socialist from Scotland, took over. They brought a band of folks together. The idea was to live communally, and everyone would share in each other's labors. No one would reap the rewards of his own labors, but we would share communally with the work we would all do. Well, as it turned out, everyone decided that there was then no point to do any work. So Robert Owen was divested of his fortune by these characters whom they imported to populate New Harmony, Indiana, and the utopia once again was a failure. I saw with the failure of New Harmony and Fanny's other projects and the failure of all these utopian reforms around us, I saw that there was a basic problem. Now, Marcus, you know, if you have a lever, you can move the world. You can even move the heart and mind of man if you have a lever. But you not only need a lever large enough, you need an external place so that you can plant your feet and work the lever to raise up man. Without this external place to plant our feet, we can't lift ourselves by our own bootstraps, so to speak. We cannot reform man through man alone. Because if Fanny was right, and if really the transcendentalist reformers were right, then really, why not follow all of our own appetites? If we could not be true to marriage as a covenant or a sacrament because we were at the mercy of our desires, if we could not even be true to a utopian ideal because we were too indolent and lazy, well, then why would I make the sacrifices that I was making in my life and in my family in order to reform a character who was really no better than an animal? I then saw that being a frank unbeliever was not enough. I did not yet recognize an external authority, but I did see the need for a church. However, I saw it had to be a church made by man. You have to realize that in my day, and very much in yours, I think, the conception of religion was very much an interior thing. The religious urge came from within. It did not come from without. It was about our own notion of God. It was not about an objective God. Perhaps it had something to do with an objective God, but it was much more important to focus on the evolution or the inevitable progress of humanity moving toward a more humane religion that helped us on this earth. Consequently, I knew We needed a church of man, not a church of God, a church of man, a church that would in fact be a part of the state. I argued not for the elimination of the separation between church and state, but that the church should in fact be dissolved and absorbed by the state. Because after all, what did the church get us up to that point, from what I could tell? The Catholic Church we had rejected. The Protestant Church was filled with hypocrites who were rolling their eyes toward heaven, who were coming to their meetings, putting money in the collection platters, funding missionaries to be sent to Africa to teach unintelligible doctrines to the heathen, while they themselves were being taught unintelligible doctrines as they sat there in their New England towns. From my point of view, that church had to be eliminated, but its ideals of virtue, its ideals for helping man, in fact, the social agenda of Christ had to be maintained. As the revolutionists in France said, citizen Christ, Christ the first sans-sculot, Christ the Republican, Christ the reformer and the lover of the poor. That's what we wanted. And I wanted a church that could be lived practically and pragmatically, because I rejected hypocrisy. And I saw that as happening through the state and through the state reform of our economic and social system. So I did not think of myself as the founder of this new church. I thought of myself merely as John the Baptist, hailing the coming Messiah who would do this. By the time we get to 1840, I have realigned myself with a vague Christian tradition, Unitarianism, Transcendentalism, but particularly I was trying to instill a religious sense of the dignity of man in my readers. By 1840, I took perhaps my boldest step before my conversion. I published The Laboring Classes, which was a long essay in which I argued for the elimination of the church and the elimination of priesthood and its vestiges. I meant the Protestant priesthood, so to speak, the Episcopal priesthood, but also Protestant pastors, because I applied the logic. If there is no sacrifice, and if there is no external authority to be communicated to man, with the priest as a bridge between God and man, if private judgment rules the day, then we must in fact reject even the notion of pastors or leaders in our churches. The church must become a part of the state. In addition to that, economic reform had to happen. And I wasn't simply advocating it vaguely. What shocked and offended people was I said, we have the ability in municipal law to change the law of inheritance. I saw the plutocracy, as I termed it, the moneyed class that was controlling everything in the United States. I saw them as very detrimental to our freedom. I accepted the argument that government had to exist for the good of the people and that our government was not. The American government then, and I would say even more so now, exists for the good of a very privileged class. My argument was, when they die, do not allow that money to be passed through their estates to their children. Break up the estates within a few generations, return capital to the people, even if that means turning away from factories and returning to a more agrarian, farm-based community. Because the important thing is equipping man with a position to reap the fruits of his own labors and to be in control of his own destiny and to end the wage slavery, as the abolitionists were arguing, to end the black slavery in the South. I argued those things. I also argued that marriage should not be entirely abandoned, but at least people should marry for love and not for money. This was published in my essay, The Laboring Classes. People were shocked and horrified. Again, I was surprised. I felt all my brother American citizens were doing was saying 2 + 2. Why would they fault me for saying make 4? Because they would accept any amount of injustice and inequity in theory or in practice, whereas they argued for democracy in theory. When I published The Laboring Classes, at the time I was a rising star in the Democratic Party. Martin Van Buren was running in 1840 for president, for re-election. Martin Van Buren was a Democrat. When I published The Laboring Classes, the Whig Party, our opposing party, ran with it. They published hundreds of thousands of copies and distributed them all over the United States and said to everyone, this is what the Democrats want. They want to take away your money. They want to take away society as we know it. They want radical reform. And The Laboring Classes by Brownson, this is proof. Van Buren lost. He blamed the loss of the election in 1840 on me and on the laboring classes. So again, I found myself having lost. I lost faith when I left the Presbyterians. I lost reason when I abandoned universalism. I was now at a point where I felt I had to lose even my program for the reform of society. I was at a very desperate period in my life, great straits. I finally came to a point where I said, everyone in America, in fact, everyone in Europe at the time, was saying, republicanism, democracy, this is the way to go. And yet I knew people well enough to know that democracy did not answer everything. It was, in fact, the people who voted for the execution of Socrates, and it was the people who said, crucify him, concerning one who was even greater than Socrates. I was under no illusions that democracy was the necessary form of government. However, I did know that we needed something beyond ourselves if we were going to achieve any reform. And I was beginning to doubt that a church of man could be made by man. I turned to philosophy. I had always loved continental literature, and I began to read in particular the French philosophers of my day. And it was my return to questions of metaphysics, and in particular epistemology, which is the question of how do we know and how do we perceive things. It was my return to that, my taking those questions seriously, that eventually brought me to the doorstep of the Catholic Church.
I wanted to ask in here that you had put yourself out on such a limb with this radical view of the laboring classes. Were you very much alone in that voice?
No one came to my defense. No one said, he means well. No one said his arguments make sense and are consistent logically. No one said he was trying to serve the interests of the poor. No one said he was trying to help the Democratic Party. I was totally and entirely abandoned. I was a pariah. Yes, Marcus, I was very much alone.
Okay. I mean, because that's tough. And you got a wife and kids and family, and there's everything. And I mean, there's this idea that here you've taken a step, and then these people that you seemingly were supporters are back.
But I will say this much. Having experienced that so many times in my life, having been accused of being a weather vane, of blowing with the wind, right, having people abandon me in my writings at various stages in my career, brought me to a point where when I did the most unpopular thing I could do, which was become a Catholic in Boston in 1844, when I finally did that, my experience of all that suffering and that abandonment by my friends and my readers, I think steeled me to do it. It strengthened me, it encouraged me, and it allowed me to be true to the truth, the final truth that I discovered, which was the Catholic Church. So there was pain, there was suffering, but it was, I think, for my benefit and ultimately for the benefit of my readers.
The Lord preparing you for
Yes.
what He was bringing to. For those of you just joining us, I'm interviewing today Orestes Brownson, classic Catholic convert and author, 19th century author. You mentioned the Catholic Church. I mean, in your journey, are you almost on the doorstep at this point?
No, but what brought me closer and what brought me to the doorstep was reading the philosophy of a Frenchman named Leroux. Philosophy from the Reformation on became, in a sense, based on private judgment. If the Reformation is marked by the rejection of external authority, philosophy begins to be marked by subjectivism, particularly with Immanuel Kant. And so what I did, what I believe a writer who came after me talks about, G.K. Chesterton, who came after me, said at one point that it would be an act of faith to assert the dogma of the reality of the stones in the street. To say that the stones in the street are real would be a bold act of faith in the modern world at some point. He's right. It takes a leap of faith to say, that's real, to get out of the prison of subjectivism. And as I was in the prison of subjectivism through the errors of the Protestant theology, I was also in that same prison philosophically. Now, Leroux spoke of the subject, the object, and the knowledge that passes between them. You see, most people are familiar with I think, therefore I am. I recognized that you have to be, you have to exist before you can think. Beyond that, a man cannot think unless he thinks about something. So that not only do I exist if I can think, but the object exists. The object must be real. I must be real. We both have being. I knew enough that being had to come from God. I had never rejected that. But what I saw in Leroux's philosophy, that when you as a subject look upon an object, say this cup, what you are doing is entering into a kind of communion. This object enters into you, in a sense, and it flows into you. There is an influence. We see this particularly when you get to know a person or read a book. There's a definite influence, a coming in, a flowing in from the object into the subject. Leroux called this communion, this knowledge, this epistemology, life. Then I went one step further and said, since we have our existence from God, what happens when the subject turns toward the object of God? Since both the subject and the object exist, when we meditate upon God, when we know God, even imperfectly and to a certain extent, when we pray to God and enter into a discussion with Him, a part of God literally flows into us. This communion, as Leroux called it, is analogous to the communion that the Catholics insisted upon, the literal taking in of the body and blood of Jesus Christ. Beyond that, it explains the Catholic concept of grace. Grace sacramentally is infused and comes into us. We only live as subjects by taking in. We take in food, we take in water and air. Intellectually, we cannot think or see or hear unless we take in, through sensory data, things around us. We only live through this communion with objects. That's natural life. Supernatural life comes to us only by means of our communion with God. When I recognized that, on the level of natural philosophy, I suddenly knew that I was in the company of Christian believers, not necessarily the Catholic Church, but I at least recognized that there could be such a thing as a natural, temporal manifestation of God's presence in the world. If He could communicate Himself to us through communion and through our perception of Him and through grace, what would prevent Him from establishing a church and establishing authority in that church, the apostles, who through their successors became the objects that communicated to the new subjects this Christian life and this life of grace? Suddenly, external, infallible authority was no longer impossible, but in fact was quite plausible. And I found that this solved all of my intellectual and spiritual quandaries. But ask me, Marcus, what that did to my courage, to my fear, to my position in the world.
Yeah.
Imagine in anti-Catholic Boston in 1843, 1844, surrounded by Protestant New England, surrounded by a country that simply assumed that Catholics were in fact to be persecuted and chased out of town or their structures burned down. All of the changes I had gone through, even though they offended people, in a sense, everyone was going through that to a certain extent. Yeah. if you left one Protestant church and started another or came to another, it was part of the American way. But to go from the Protestant world to the Catholic world, to go from transcendentalism to the Catholic world, to go from agnostic world reform and socialism into the Catholic world, that was leaving one entire universe for another, in a sense. For a year, I did nothing out of fear and out of prudence, perhaps. Finally, I presented myself to the Bishop of Boston. I told him that I was in a position where I wanted to be received into the church. He presented me with his coadjutor bishop, who gave me instruction in the faith. It did not go well at first because I wanted to protect my own natural philosophy, this philosophy of life or communion. And I was afraid that he would tell me it wasn't Catholic and I had to abandon it. When I finally came out with that, he said, well, there's nothing in that contradicts Catholic teaching. It's not the whole story, and it doesn't really account for revelation, but it is, as far as natural philosophy goes, it might in fact be an aid or a help to non-believers to bring them closer to the church. Once we worked that out, eventually, October 22nd, 1844, I received absolution, I was conditionally baptized, and I was confirmed into the Catholic faith.
1844, for our modern listeners, for some would be a date that they would think about, in the sense that we also know of another fairly well-known Catholic convert that had entered the church about the same time, but he was on the other side of the pond.
Yes.
Could you talk a little bit about, did you have any relationship with him?
Yes, well, of course, I knew of John Henry Newman. I knew of the Oxford, the Tractarians, as we called them, and I knew of their strengths and their weaknesses. Newman was an intellectual giant. Newman's conversion was a profound moment in the world of our day. It happened a year after mine. Many people, I think, since then, Marcus, have looked back upon Newman's conversion and my conversion, which happened within a year of one another, almost to the day. October 9th, 1845, I believe, was his date. Mine was just a little less than a year before his. His conversion led to what some have called the Catholic literary revival. Writers like G.K. Chesterton, Hilaire Belloc, Evelyn Waugh, and so forth. Many people count Oscar Wilde even among that group. However, in America, people have not been able to point to anything like that coming from my conversion. And I think a lot of that has to do with the fact that we're a different culture here in America. But I will say that I was also familiar with Mark Twain, who was young enough to be my son. But Mark Twain, similar to me, I believe, was formed in a very Calvinistic, judgmental, puritanical, and very sour Christian tradition. He had a heart also as mine with a great longing. He was also a man with a great desire for love, as was Nathaniel Hawthorne, whom I knew. Even the Transcendentalists, we all had this great desire for man and for truth. We all had a contempt for the sham and the hypocrisy around us. And yet, had Mark Twain understood, as I eventually did, the truth of the Catholic Church, I think all American literature would have been different. Perhaps even if Hawthorne and some of the Transcendentalists had come to what I came to, but I came there by the grace of God, perhaps also we would have had an American Catholic literary revival.
There is so much I would love to ask you, Orestes. We've only got about a minute left. I'm going to hit you with one last question. And you kind of gave me this idea when you said that when you were coming into the church, you were afraid that you would have to let go of your philosophy. As you look back over your long life, you had a lot of things to let go of. At what point did you let go of Orestes?
Well, that's a marvelous question. I don't know if we ever completely let go of ourselves during our life on earth. I can speak from a supernatural perspective. there's a connecting link between everything I was and everything I became. There's a link between nature and grace, between the natural and the supernatural, between God and man. And if we sow to the Spirit and not to the flesh, that question is eventually answered.
All right. Well, let me tell our audience what a great pleasure it's been, not just to interview Orestes Bronson, but to be interviewing Kevin O'Brien, playing Orestes Bronson. Those of you with EWT are familiar with Kevin. He's from the Theater of the Word, incorporated as thewordinc.org. And again, Kevin, thank you for this. May I ask you with one quick second, did you enjoy being Orestes?
Marcus, I love playing these characters, and I hope to do it again here on The Journey Home.
Well, you know you're always welcome to do that. Thank you for your work. If the people want to know more about your work, again, where would they go?
Thewordinc.org, T-H-E, wordinc.org.
Thank you, Orestes,
Thank
for
you,
sharing your
Marcus.
journey
Thank you.
with us on The Journey Home. I hope you enjoyed this special episode of The Journey Home. God bless you. See you next week.